We are live.
Great, thanks, Ed. Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of the Better Together webinar series. I am Martha Heater, filling in for Rashonda Lanier Jackson today to talk with our esteemed guests, Ira Goldstein and Michael Smith. Just so pleased that the both of you were able to join us today. Thank you all both so much for giving us your time today. We're just really excited. As folks are logging on, I just wanted to give a little bit of background. If this is the first time that you've joined one of our webinars this morning, these are hosted almost monthly by PlanRVA, where we put together a program that is hopefully informative and a bit inspiring, talking about those projects and partnerships that are happening in our region that make things better when we come together. So this is a chance for us to step back, step out of the work that we do within PlanRVA, and really focus on those exciting opportunities to come together and coordinate and partner and celebrate collaboration. So if you're not familiar with PlanRVA, we were established in 1969, formerly known as the Richmond Regional Planning District Commission, now known as PlanRVA. And we have been the home of cooperation among the 9 jurisdictions across the Central Virginia region for more than 50 years. Today, we focus on areas of community development, emergency management, the environment, and transportation. And we are always looking for new opportunities to celebrate the good work that's happening in the region. So it is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Ira Goldstein, President of Policy Solutions at Reinvestment Fund, which is a results-oriented, socially responsible community investment group based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Ira has conducted spatial and statistical analyses in communities across the US. I think we're going to hear a little bit about that today and how that relates to Richmond. And he also has been a lecturer for University of Pennsylvania's Penn Urban Studies program for over 30 years. There he instructs research methods, statistics, and housing policy. He is a fellow within the Penn's Institute for Urban Research and sits on the board of Children First PA. Before coming to Reinvestment Fund, Goldstein served as Mid-Atlantic Director of Fair Housing and Equal Rights at HUD. Michael Smith is a certified planner, so after our own heart with his credentials, and he currently serves as Program and Strategy Officer at the Richmond Memorial Health Foundation here in Richmond. In that role, he co-leads the foundation's General Operating Support Grant-Making Program. His duties include the implementation and evaluation of the foundation's strategy and outcomes, building and maintaining relationships with organizations and networks to assess the social, economic, and political context of their work. Michael completed his bachelor's degree in urban and environmental planning from the University of Virginia, and he is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners, the coordinating committee of the Democratizing Development Program at the Neighborhood Founders Group, and the Community Advisory Board of Virginia Public Media. Michael is an alum of the Terrence Keenan Institute for the Emerging Leaders in Health Philanthropy, serving as a fellow in 2020. It is such a pleasure to have the two of you with us joining today. Want to make a note to our attendees, please feel free to add your questions in the chat or the Q&A. We'll be monitoring those sections throughout the webinar, and we'll make sure that we have time at the end of the hour for questions from the audience. So let's jump in. I'll just start by saying, it's just such a pleasure, as I mentioned. I'm gushing a little bit today because for me, hosting this webinar is really an opportunity to come full circle. Michael, as you know, was a participant in the 2017 Equity and Health Fellowship Program that RMHF hosted. It was just a superb opportunity for me to be able to network with peers and to be able to really understand the fundamentals of what it looks like to think about health equity. We can incorporate the principles of equity and health into the planning work across the region. One of the many recommendations from that fellowship program in our report back to the board of directors was to focus more intensely on the role of RMHF in convening, facilitating, and bringing resources to the community. So it has really been a pleasure to see not only the work of that fellowship evolve over time, but to see the opportunities for PlanRVA and RMHF to deepen their relationship together. The market value analysis is just one of those many areas that we've really, I think, teamed up in an exciting way. So Michael, I wanted to start with you first. Tell us a little bit about why the Health Foundation decided to do this project and how did we get here?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Martha, and good afternoon, everyone. For those on the call that don't know what RMHF is, we are a health legacy foundation, and therefore, traditionally, our work has been more focused on addressing the immediate needs of people's health outcomes and obstacles to better health. That traditionally looked at our support of our health safety net clinics in the region. But over the past about 6 or so years, the board at the foundation began to have much deeper conversations around the social determinants of health, right? So what are those conditions that exist within your neighborhood, exist within your ability to access education, access transportation, access your places of employment, and also to just overall have a better quality of life? How does that actually lead to overall better health outcomes? And so that led to deeper conversations around housing as a social determinant of health. And as the board started to get more confident in their understanding of the intersection of health and housing, that opened up relationships for the foundation to partners that we had not historically been in relationship with. And what that led to was the foundation being the recipient of an award called Invest Health. Invest Health was an initiative that was began at the Shop Ira Works at Reinvestment Fund, supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And what that award allowed the foundation to do was deeper its understanding of health and housing by by engaging partners in the Richmond region that spanned all sectors, whether it's in philanthropy, whether it's in the public sector, private sector, or community finance. And one of the outcomes of the Invest Health work was the development of a 2017 market value analysis. We understood that if we are going to further understanding of the social determinants of health, we need to have data to support that work. And so the 2017 MVA was an opportunity for us to see our region differently. It focused on the city, Henrico County, and Chesterfield County. But it also, as I mentioned before, put us in different relationships with our partners in the region, where we were able to have conversations around how a foundation could use their resources to address the root causes as to why housing was becoming inaccessible, becoming unaffordable, and why the quality of our housing units needed to be addressed as well. That work, as I said, was completed in 2017. That precipitated more opportunities for the foundation to be in initiatives that were trying to fill the gaps that existed from the findings of the 2017 MVA. How could we as a foundation convene and allocate resources to support some of the work that we already saw happening in our region from nonprofit partners, public partners, and others to address our kind of imbalance of affordable housing? And that work led to an initiative called Connect Capital, where we were seeking to try to understand how we could consolidate resources. As Martha mentioned, she was a member of the Equity and Health Fellowship class that the foundation supported. That, as Martha mentioned, that fellowship class charged us as a foundation to think more about how we could support policy and advocacy and civic engagement. And now we have moved in that direction over the past few years, where we now have a strategic framework that explicitly speaks to how we as a foundation want to use general operating support funding to advance policy and advocacy and civic engagement to understand further how we can address the social determinants of health. And as we began to move into that strategic framework, an opportunity arose to reevaluate the 2017 MVA. In fact, the opportunity arose in a couple of different ways. One, that we kind of understood that we were coming out of a pandemic, and we were coming out of not only a pandemic, an environment in Richmond where housing costs had accelerated, housing opportunity had decreased for those on moderate and low incomes. And that's something that we knew we needed to further understand and get a handle on. And the MVA is a great tool to do that. And so that's one way in which we knew we wanted to be in support of facilitating this process to update the tool. But also the Richmond 300 Comprehensive Plan noted it as an implementation goal of theirs. They also at the city, as they have been doing engagement across our city to create the comprehensive plan and ultimately get it approved by city council, heard from many members of the community that housing was one of the biggest priorities and one of the biggest things we needed to tackle. And so they brought an opportunity to us to think about how we could support updating the VA, and there we were. And so, yes, it's not often, I guess, as a health foundation is in the work of supporting opportunities like the market value analysis. However, as we as a foundation try to lean into our mission of advancing a healthy and equitable Richmond region, we know that data and the understanding of our current conditions is critical. And so the MVA allows us to not only have informed conversations internally with board and staff, but to bring together partners that maybe don't have the opportunities to often come together and sit around a table and really think about how we understand our community from a quantitative perspective, but also a qualitative perspective.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate that background. That's really helpful. Ira, when it pitch it to you, I mean, what is this MVA anyway? We've heard a lot about it from Michael, but it sounds like it's just data. So tell us a little bit about it.
Sure, Martha, thanks. And I'm going to share my screen now so people can see some visuals as we're chatting. So what the MVA is it is a tool that we created, the concept of which we created over 20 years ago now in the city of Philadelphia. And really what it was about was essentially trying to use a variety of very contemporary, very geographically refined measures of what's happening in a housing market and statistically validate them and to work with a local group of stakeholders, which the Health Foundation and PlanRVA, frankly, helped us sort of figure out who that needed to be. And we'll talk about that more later. But basically to take these data and try and sort of analyze them statistically so that you could get an understanding of the locale's real estate market. The resulting analytic is one which takes all of the little geographies of the region. In this instance, the region is, as Michael said, the entirety of the city of Richmond, most of Henrico and Chesterfield counties, leaving out only the farthest reaches of those counties where the population density is pretty low. With that geography and with that total geography, we are working at what's known as the census block group level, which is about a fifth or a sixth the size of a census tract, really small, perfect geography for if you were to think about, taking a walk a mile and a half down Broad Street, you might see 5 or 6 different conditions. Those block groups will really reflect that mosaic of what you see better than any other larger geography. And then, as I said, the result is a categorization of all those little subgeographies into groups using the dimensions that we had in the Richmond MVA, or in the Richmond area MVA. We're using the following pieces of information to characterize areas. We're looking at real estate sale transactions, residential transactions, and we'll typically look at a couple of year time period. We look at the variability of those transactions. We look at the extent to which bank sales are involved in it. In other words, financial distress in the market. We look at owner occupancy. We look at the extent to which the rental stock is subsidized or not. We look at vacancy, density, new construction, and permitting activity, all as evidence of investment into an area. Again, all of that data is attached to all these little census geographies, these little block groups, sorted into categories, and the result are these categories, each of which has a letter A through I, wherein what you can expect is no matter where you see them on a map, and I'll show you the map in a second, no matter where you see it on the map, the A's are like A's all over the place, but they're different from B's, and B's are like B's all over the place, but they're different from A's and C's, et cetera. Generally speaking, you can think about those A's and B markets really as the strongest, economically strongest, most opportune places that exist within the region. You can think of those H's and I's, the G's and the H's and the I's, as the places that manifest some varying levels of economic distress. And if you can think about the other, the C, the D, the E, the F, as those are kind of your middle markets. Those are the neighborhoods that are variably stronger or little bits of stress, but generally are providing the residents of those places a good, decent place to be, a relatively opportune area, a variety of different housing types and investment levels and things like that. So now I'm going to turn to the map. This is the entire region. And again, what you'll recall is that the A's and the B's, those purples, are the strongest parts of the region in there, and you're going to see it. A lot of it at the far reaches of Chesterfield and Henrico County, and a bit in the city of Richmond. In the B markets, which you'll see a lot more in the city than in the suburban counties, because those are very strong markets, but much more renter occupied than owner occupied. And those will exist a little bit more in the city than you see in suburban areas or the Chesterfield and Henrico County. And then those, those gold colors, the G's, the H's, and the I's, those are really, you're going to see them preponderantly in the city, but you also see them, in different parts of Chesterfield and Henrico, and certainly in Chesterfield as you move south from the city along, 95 or Jefferson Davis Highway, you'll see a sort of a collection of those more stressed markets. And then in the eastern part of Henrico County, you'll see groupings like that. If we drill into the city a little more, it'll just give you a little bit of a closer look. Just briefly before I sort of kick it back to Martha, let me just say what people do with this stuff in general, and we'll talk about it some more. But basically, communities use these, and we're doing these all over the country, frankly. Communities are using them to make a variety of decisions about how to target and deliver their programs, how to think about resourcing different sorts of things like housing construction versus housing rehabilitation. They're using these tools to do things related to understanding the challenges that may exist in a place vis-a-vis fair housing issues. So communities around the country, big and small, Houston, Texas, down to Selma, Alabama, I mean, they were basically using it for a variety of purposes that we find really great, because at the end of the day, we feel like, if these kinds of resourcing and programmatic decisions can be made with an eye towards, rooting them in objective, rigorous, field and human validated data, the prospects of making better decisions are greater. And let me stop there so that we can move on to other parts of the discussion.
Thanks so much, Ira. Michael, I'm curious, you mentioned this earlier, that this isn't really something that a lot of health foundations maybe participate in or support. And you talked about why, but I'm just curious, what is this tool, the data from 2017, and then again, refresh in 2021 and 2022, what does that do for a health foundation in our community?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we began having conversations internally about supporting the update of the 2017 MVA, obviously we engaged our trustees at the beginning. We are a trustee-driven foundation, so they are very active and involved in the decisions that are made as regards to our resource allocation and just where we spend our time as a partner in our community. And what we had learned from the 2017 MVA was there was an opportunity to think about engaging our partners in the communities that they represent differently through this tool. What the beautiful thing is about the MVA and its geographic scope is that we're touching many different corners of our region, many different experiences of our region, and many different populations. And as a foundation that works across the region, we have the privilege of being in relationship with many different partners that are telling us about what communities are going through as it relates to their ability to attain better health through their ability to access housing and maintain housing. And so that's something that we wanted to really center in this process. And so we wanted to really lift up the communities that we had seen in studies dating back from the original 2017 MVA and all other subsequent studies that have looked at how health is occurring in our region. And we're seeing that communities that are Black and Brown were being impacted the most acutely. And therefore, we wanted to make sure that this process centered the lived experiences of Black and Brown communities. So we wanted to engage different partners that have relationships or are in communities where they're seeking to do that type of civic engagement and power building work. We also, as I mentioned earlier, knew that members of the 2017 Equity and Health Fellowship class wanted to see us deepen our understanding of policy and advocacy. So we wanted to understand how could we utilize this process of developing this MVA to understand in real time for partners at the steering committee, what are solutions you all are thinking about right now? What's working? What could work? And how can this MVA be better of a tool for you to bring back to your community so that you can activate conversations around potential solutions as it relates to housing and as it relates to economic development or wealth building. And then, like I mentioned, we are leaning into a new strategic framework for the foundation, where we really are trying to allow our grant resources to accelerate policy and advocacy and civic engagement. And we wanted to really understand how can a tool like the MVA help us as a foundation begin to understand modeling of those practices and modeling of conversations we can have with partners around, we are a partner in the community as a foundation that wants to see your organization, if you so choose, best go in the direction of policy and advocacy that you seek. And so we want to make sure this MVA process and the way we engage over the past year or so allow people to understand that we are a foundation that is supportive of that. And the MVA is just a great way for us to engage in those conversations.
Thanks for that, Michael. Ira, you mentioned that this this framework is something that communities all across the country have adopted. You guys work with a number of different communities, probably on a regular basis, large and small. What types of things, what kinds of actions come from the use of the MVA in those communities? And I'm also interested to know what's different about the way that we've got a regional market value analysis here, and is that something that you do elsewhere?
Yeah. So communities use their MVAs in just a whole host of different ways. One of the things that I think makes me most optimistic about all the ways that the Richmond area has used the MVA in the past and will use it in the future is our sense doing these things is that there is something hugely democratizing for a community, for everybody to have a common understanding of what's happening in a place, as opposed to one group of people, decision makers, feeling like they know something, and then residents feeling like they don't have voice. So the idea of making all this information, as we have and will more in the future, available to everybody, we think is like hugely democratizing for enhancing voice. I think it's also the case that, Michael and the foundation did an extraordinary job, and I think probably uniquely extraordinary in terms of our experience in other places, in terms of setting up a variety of different groups that were very intentionally populated with people that Michael and the foundation invited to make sure that a variety of opinions and perspectives and experiences and the like could be in this mix as the MVA was being created and as the sort of ancillary analytics were being constructed. Now, what makes the Richmond market unique? I mean, in terms of the process, I think that, what Michael and the foundation did, and Martha and you and PlanRVA, I think were, hugely important in that as well, was getting that, the opportunity for that wide variety of voices, both seasoned professionals and young leaders as well. Michael was very intentional in terms of trying to identify that. But in terms of the market itself, what makes it unique? I think that one of the things that makes it unique, and probably a bit of a challenge for Richmond area residents, is that, if we go back to that table that I showed earlier, there really were these price points in the Richmond area that were substantially higher than we typically see in communities that we work. Not only at the high end, where the prices in any market, whether or not it's Philadelphia or Baltimore or Pittsburgh or Houston or Dallas or Richmond, where there's an expensive market. Well, Dallas probably had the most expensive markets in sort of that North Dallas area. But in the more stressed markets in the Richmond area, those price points were actually way higher than what we were seeing in other places, which meant that, in essence, the people who were residing in the neighborhoods, in those G's and those H's and those I's, were really paying in some ways premium prices for real estate markets that really weren't premium vis-a-vis other markets. And I think that was a really important difference that we saw in Richmond, both in 2017, and by the way, even amplified in this most recent MVA. One of the similarities that we saw between Richmond and other cities that we see is, and I think that this speaks to, at least some dimension of the social determinants of health that Michael was raising, was that those middle market areas, as segregated as the Richmond area is racially and ethnically, those middle market places really are the integrated parts of the Richmond market. And those are the neighborhoods that stand as the sort of the living, breathing example that people of multiple racial groupings of people and ethnic groupings of people can live together in communities, and those have, viable, opportune markets, and, they are the examples that works. We see that in other places. What makes the Richmond aspect of it unique is that the Richmond area is actually fairly segregated, but the integration is occurring in those places. And I think that those are important to sort of understand and study and focus on and really try and cultivate so you get sort of more of those. Also, I think one last thing that I would bring up, and probably come back to it later, is we really were able this time to understand a little bit more than almost any other place the role of private investors in the market. And I think that is something that you'll start to see a lot of attention to in the popular press, whether or not it's Redfin publications or things that you read in Forbes or what have you. But, we really were able to sort of advance the ball and in terms of an understanding of what's happening there in this Richmond MVA.
Thanks for that, Ira. I wanted to take a moment and just say, I think, because Michael, this is going to lead into the question I have for you. I think in 2017, many of the folks that sat around the table can't really say that the data showed them something significant that they didn't already know. I think many of the experts, our community experts that participated in that process, it was validating, quite honestly. They validated the data validated what we thought we understood to be occurring in the neighborhoods. But I think headed into the 2021 and 2022 update really was kind of like an uncertainty. What did this pandemic in our community mean to these neighborhoods and these markets? And I can't help but think, what will the next iteration show us as we think about, how interest rates and inflation and everything like that and the economic conditions that we are experiencing now, how that will yet again impact the transition, so to speak, of these neighborhoods. I know one of the things that was most profound for me in both of the processes was really being able to see the similarities of neighborhoods that are completely on opposite ends of the region, the study area. And that I think was really interesting to see, some of the factors that are existing in some of the localities are occurring elsewhere in the region. And that was really interesting, and sort of to be able to study the adjacencies and that kind of thing. Now, I do want to take a minute to say to everybody that's listening, we're going to be posting the data actually online this summer. So we're working with Reinvestment Fund and RMHF to be able to actually make all of this information publicly accessible. And we're going to be releasing stories online to be able to really investigate and analyze the findings, some of the kind of ahas, so to speak. And so this webinar is really kind of a kickoff of that release, not the tail end. So Michael, feel free to take this question in either kind of the form process of what we've been able to accomplish thus far, or really dig into the data. But I'm curious, what were some of the key takeaways for you or lessons learned from being involved in this 2022 study?
Yeah, and to that point too, about the upcoming uploading of this data online, if you do and maybe I can put this somewhere in the chat or something. We have a piece that Ira actually helped produce on our website at RMHF, where we talk about just some of the initial findings of the MVA, where the share of homes that were affordable at a kind of $250 price point, the share had been dramatically reduced from the 2017 MVA to this current one. So that was one of the kind of initial findings that we saw. And Ira mentioned a little bit about how that impacts overall community well-being and opportunity. And, you know, something that I took away also from this process was, to Martha's point, I think because we are community enrichment, that we do work collectively to understand what's happening in real time with market conditions, namely housing conditions in our region. You know, we've been doing that, I think, in earnest since, unfortunately, we were put on the New York Times for our eviction crisis, and that kind of that precipitated and demanded more collective action from partners across the region to understand how do we really tackle this and what's happening. And that led to initiatives such as the Richmond Regional Housing Framework supported by PHA, which put a highlight on what our region looks like, but also some potential policy solutions. So we kind of already had a sense of what our communities looked like. But I think what was different in terms of this current process of updating the MVA to the 2022 one was that we were having partners that work on the ground at the table, actually validating and adding more context to some of these findings around our community dynamics. Yes, we saw some communities that had drastically changed from 2017 to now, particularly in our Southside communities. But to hear around what was happening in terms of engagement of the members of that community, engaging particular landlords of that community, how rent relief was supporting stability in those communities, that was something that I really took away as in terms of how data is not just a quantitative tool, but also how you add the stories and the context to it in its real-time fashion by having those opportunities through the MVA Steering Committee to lift up those conversations. I think something we also took away was just how improvement in neighborhoods from 2017 were impacting, unfortunately, some of our senior communities and those that are on fixed incomes just by sheer proximity to streets and blocks that had seen improvements into their housing conditions. And unfortunately, that translates into higher property tax assessments. And we were able to see where some of those really stark increases of property tax assessments from 2017 to now were occurring. I think we kind of had an anecdotal understanding of where those were, but to really see that in real time and to hear from folks that are in relationship with those communities, how that might be impacting those members that are on limited means was something that really was a strong takeaway for me, and something that I'm still kind of wrestling and resolving internally around what can we do to make sure members of our community that have given so much of their time, their love to this city and to this region are able to remain stably housed. And so that was just one of the key takeaways, our ability to really look at this data, understand it with a different context, particularly our understanding of how race intersects with this data. That was something that was one of the biggest takeaways for me.
Thanks for that, Michael. Really appreciate it. So Ira, one of my favorite things about you is, you know, you've been touching this information for different communities now for a while, but it seems like every time you work with a community, you're looking at it through a fresh set of eyes. You're discovering, you know, what's going on. You're using all of that knowledge, but you're kind of rediscovering these markets. And I'm interested to know from your perspective, key takeaways, maybe some of the, you dropped a couple of nuggets earlier about, or teasers for us about some of the things that might make the Richmond market unique. Also just curious what's tracking with other communities that you've studied recently.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Martha. I appreciate that. And that is something that I try and do. So thank you for acknowledging it. You know, one of the things that I think really struck us, and it you know, began to come to us from the process that the foundation and PlanRVA put together for these various groups who were involved in the, you know, sort of the moving of this project forward, was we were hearing investors are coming here, they're buying up houses. And, and as I said, when we construct the MVA, we do a fair amount of validation in the field, in addition to getting the feedback from these individuals. But, the vigor with which people were making that point to us really sort of drove us back out into the field to try and take a look and understand a little bit better about what's going on. And what I'd like to do is share my screen again and show folks a couple visuals of the particular thing that we're talking about here. Hang on one second. Okay, so one of the unique things we were able to do here, and we really pushed because it seemed like such an area of emphasis for people amongst the various stakeholder groups, was looking at this transition of ownership of homes, particularly from owners to owners to investors. And why would anybody care about that? Well, at some level, there may well be some good aspects of that. Of investors making investments in the communities. On the other hand, what we worry about in some of these kinds of transactions is whether or not what you see in some neighborhoods, particularly more modest income neighborhoods of color, where you see a transition of resident owners to outside investors purchasing the properties and populating them with resident renters. And so what you see is that sort of loss of the housing related wealth. So again, and these were points that were being made to us by, in a very emphatic way by the folks in these stakeholder groups. So what you're seeing here is a map drilled in now principally to the city of Richmond. And the block groups that you're seeing here are shaded from light to dark, representing the percentage of the sale transactions over the last couple of years that went what we call here from owners to owners. So in other words, I own a house, I sell it to Michael, or Martha owns a house, she sells it to me, an owner to an owner. Well, what you see is at the far reaches of the city, certainly pushing out into the parts at least of Chesterfield and Henrico that you can see, a lot more dark areas, which means that becomes the more preponderant way that the properties are transacting. In fact, in those darkest areas, it's over 80%. But if you go more into the city, you'll see lighter colors. So that means that smaller shares of those transactions are sort of the normal owner-to-owner transaction. So what are they, though? Now, this is homes that were sold by owners to investors. Again, the darker areas are places where that percentage is higher. The lighter areas are percentages where it's lower. Look at that sort of southern part of the city of Richmond, so again, sort of pushing down, towards Chesterfield County. What you're seeing in that area is larger percentages of people who are owners selling those places to renters. And that's sort of a different phenomenon. In other words, sort of like owners to investors, excuse me, clear. It's very different phenomena. And again, what you sort of think about is, what are the impacts that this has on neighborhoods? What are the impacts this has on the people who sold to investors? This is investors to owners. So this would be, think about flipping phenomena, right? Where I buy a house, I fix it up a little bit, and I turn it over to somebody else. Well, there is one little part south of VCU Medical Center where there is some, density of that going on, and a few parts sort of on the outer edge of the city of Richmond. But in the main, that isn't, like a huge thing. But what was interesting was when we went out field validating, we could see, particularly the first area that I pointed out to you, there's tons of activity. You'll see people buying houses, fixing them up, and then putting them back up for sale. But here's one of the things that sort of summarizes it all, because I want to sort of get through this with leaving time for conversation. What we do is we took each of those MVA market types and broke down all of the sales that occur within those market types by what the nature of the transaction is. That first column is the share of owners to owners. So in those really strong markets, markets, those are really the preponderant forms of transactions. But when you get down into those stressed markets, substantially less. And in those I markets, half are owners to owners. That means half are not. Now, what are they to? Well, look at that in that I market and the H in the I market. Substantial percentages are going from owners to investors. These are people who are essentially no longer homeowners, right? And if we look at the shares from investors to owners, they're sort of a little bit more clustered in those, E, F, and G markets. And then investor to investor, you could think about that as an investor having a portfolio and flipping it to another investor who wants to adjust their portfolio. But really, in a way, it's those first three columns that really start to differentiate. And, if you sort of think about, and we haven't pulled the, enough layers off the onion here yet to understand fully what's going on. But those G, H, and I markets really do tend to be the places in the city of Richmond and in the counties where you're seeing larger concentrations of families of color. And those are places where you're seeing that loss of ownership at much higher rates than in some of the stronger or even middle market areas. And that gives us pause, because if you think about it, if you buy the argument that many make, which is home ownership is one of the ways that we're going to be able to sort of carve into that, that wealth gap that exists between groupings. And if you see, that was all the things that we're all trying to do to close that gap, but then a third of the transactions are going out the door in those I markets, for example, or a quarter in those H markets. As much as you're sort of like rowing the boat in one direction to try and close that gap, it's being sort of pulled out from under you. And so this, I believe, is going to be the kind of thing that, we, the community of Richmond, would want to dig into to understand, firstly, the nuance of all this more than we have here, what the potential benefits are, but what the potential challenges are, and who benefits and who doesn't. So let me stop there and stop sharing my screen.
Thanks for that, Ira. I appreciate that. I'm watching the time and I'm realizing that we're getting close to the end here. So I'm thinking I'm going to ask each of you one more question and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. But I guess just a little bit more about that. I mean, it certainly looks to me from looking at that table that you just showed that there's a correlation anyway between the ratios of what those different transactions look like relative to the class of the market that we're talking about, whether it's an A market or an I market. And so, do we know from looking at other communities whether this is a phenomenon that's happening, and are we normal? Can we use this in a way to kind of benchmark and see, are these actual indicators of something happening in a neighborhood, or is it really ending an opportunity for generational wealth accumulation?
Yeah. So Martha, I think that is the hugely important question. And what I would say is, we don't know a ton about it yet. I mean, I think that, we've read a lot about the penetration of investors into the housing market, but it tends to be sort of at the city or regional level. There's almost nothing that sort of drills into the neighborhoods and starts to look at it. So I think that, quite frankly, this work in the city of Richmond is way ahead of where we are with other places. And I think that this is going to be a place where we can learn an awful lot more. I think that, yes, there is that correlation that you see. But I also think that there will be, if we can learn more about it, there will be opportunities to think about advocacy around federal and state policy, to sort of think about, curbing as much as we can the adverse consequences of that and maximizing the benefits of investment dollars flowing into a neighborhood. But then also really getting a good handle on what this is doing for that racial wealth gap, because we do know in Richmond and in other places that those stressed markets do tend to be the places that are disproportionately home to people of color, because, in some measure, at least, of those income differences that we observe and wealth differences.
Just one follow-up question to that. This is a multi-jurisdictional study, and so do we see differences in the way that these activities are occurring in the kind of urban center of the city versus suburban or exurban communities? I mean, these are pretty urbanized counties that surround the city of Richmond. So what do you see as far as maybe the difference in those three localities?
I'm not sure that we know enough yet to know what those systematic differences are. I do think that if you sort of stare at the maps a little bit, you'll see a little bit of that sort of portfolio shifting occurring in a way in different parts of the region. But what I would also say, and we don't know enough about it yet in Richmond, but in another community where we did not as advanced a look as we did here in Richmond, but in the Jacksonville community, which is a county, a city of about 1 million, so a little bigger than Richmond, but what we learned there is that there are different sort of sorts of investors, and those investors tend to focus based on what they know best and what their market is. So for example, in the Jacksonville market, there were the very sort of large corporate BlackRock kinds of investors that really focused all of their investment activity, very heavy investment activity, in the beach communities along the sort of the coast of Duval County. And then you had other sorts of investors like the smaller ones that they very much focused on a different strata in the markets, what in Richmond would have been like the EF&G markets, for example. And so one of the things that I think is going to be really important as we go forward in Richmond is to start to understand perhaps who these investors are, because what we can do to get, to sort of maximize again the positives of their investment and minimize the negatives of their investment, I think in some ways will be related to the nature of the institutions themselves. And certainly, the things that we might be thinking about in terms of protections for people who become tenants could be very different, whether or not we're thinking about large institutional investors or what people sort of euphemistically refer to as mom and pop investors. But I think there's still way more to learn and lots of nuance that we have to get. What we've observed here is the pattern, and it's now imperative to sort of pull back the layers of that onion.
Thanks, Ira. I appreciate it. So Michael, last question for you. RMHF has been such a leader in really being, generous with resources to be able to lead this effort. And I think you said this so well earlier, it's not just about philanthropy in grant making. Certainly that's a vital part of the system and of the sector. But I think, the leadership here from RMHF to really stand alongside community-based organizations and other institutions to be able to understand what's happening in the community first before trying to dictate intervention strategies is just commendable. And so I wanted to ask, how does this really exemplify the way that RMHF is evolving and what role it's playing in the community? Sort of, I guess this is the what next question, right?
Yeah.
Like how does this really put a stake in the ground? Because it seems like it does for how you guys plan to show up in the future.
Yeah, and again, a slight little plug for the website because we do talk about our equity journey. We're still trying to understand as we talk about supporting a more healthy and equitable richer region, how we define that. And I think what this MVA opportunity does is it further refines the intricacies of how individuals in neighborhoods, community partners in neighborhoods interpret equity for themselves. And I think that's the beautiful thing about doing a regional based approach effort like this is there's many different interpretations and practices that are happening from Northern Henrico to Eastern Henrico to Southern Chesterfield into the city. And I think that makes us as a foundation much more well-informed so that as we continue to try to be a champion and a voice and a convener for health and racial equity, that we have a much more comprehensive, broad-based understanding of what that looks like for our region. And so we hope that what this precipitates moving forward is an opportunity to be more of a partner in terms of engaging different community-based organizations, different networks that exist, different institutions, as to how we as a foundation, as you mentioned, are not just trying to use our financial resources and move out the way, even though we do like to move out the way and make sure that organizations that we do fund have the ability and the space and time to do what they do well, but to really tap into our institutional power as a convener and to really lean into that and lean in it so that people in our neighborhoods and our region understand that we are a partner that wants to really address the inequities that have been existing in our communities for generations through engagement and through policy and advocacy, because we know that's how the structural issues that exist will be resolved.
Thanks, Michael. So this is the time where we're going to open it up for Q&A from members of the audience. So if anybody has a question, feel free to raise your hand in the system if you'd like, or you can type your questions into the chat or the Q&A section. I'll just ask kind of to take that one step further. We plan today's session to be a little bit more process focused than data driven. And I think the idea is we're going to do webinars over the next couple of months that really probably drill into some of these characteristics a bit more. But to kick off the Q&A part, I'm curious, Michael, can you tell a little bit, just sort of in keeping in the theme of the webinar series, what it took to put this together? I mean, the actual data compilation, frankly, doesn't take that long. The team is fast. And so I'm curious about that. And then Ira, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about the process, because I think it's pretty unique what you guys do on the way of field verification.
Yeah, well, first off, it took committed partners like PlanRVA to kind of help convene initially a core set of partners at your space to really think through where we show up for each other. First we had to really get clear on values and principles. We knew that engaging in a process like this, inviting 18 different partners to sit with us for 8 months or so, really would require a sense of unity, stepping into that room amongst the different core partners like PlanRVA, like RMHF, like Reinvestment Fund, and like the city. And so just getting those values and principles around health and housing being one of the values of which we want to lift at this work. Democratization of data, centering the voices that had not historically been at tables like this. This was something that we really had to get clear on as a core team. And then, Ira mentioned, the kind of uniqueness of the steering committee. We really were intentional about wanting people that were on the steering committee not to just show up with the kind of titles that they wear at their organizations, but the networks that they are involved in, because we knew the way to kind of matriculate this information throughout our region will require people bringing it to their networks with a sense of trust and belief that they understood what this work was and that they understood how this work could benefit them down the road. And so we really put together this engagement framework. It was kind of our MVA Bible, so to speak. And it talked about the goals that have been established within the RMHF trustees, the goals and values that we wanted to set forward within this MVA steering committee, and our principles for engagement. And then obviously the outcomes. What do we desire at the end of this? And we spent the first meeting of the steering committee walking through that framework, making sure that this framework was clear, that it had input from all those members of the steering committee, and that we were going to move forward from that meeting, understanding where we show up for each other. And so that was a really special process to be part of, and hopefully something we can replicate down the road as we do more of these type of initiatives.
And Martha, in terms of process, I do think, quickly that it was very much informed by these groups that Michael just described, and again, the very intentional way that they were constructed, the framework that everybody sort of collectively developed. And by the way, the important thing that we were, I think, successful at was cultivating that notion that in bringing all these different voices to the table, there needed to be a level of comfort and capacity to give frank feedback about what we're getting, what we're missing, what we're not understanding. And we got an awful lot of that. And I think that was very helpful. In terms of the practical aspects of what it took to get it going, basically, we got data from 3 different groupings, the city as well as Chesterfield and Henrico County. All of that needed to be synced up. It needed to be cleaned and then statistically analyzed and mapped. But we also do a big field validation component. So people are literally driving around the region with all of the data on a laptop that's GPS enabled, and we're checking out home sales, and we're checking out vacancies, and we're checking out evidence of building permitting or new construction and things like that. So it is a very detailed, both in the field validation, on the computer validation, and constructive questioning from the stakeholder group.
Awesome, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Ira and Michael, for joining us today. I would be remiss if I didn't say what a pleasure it has been working with the both of you over the last year on this project. And I'm getting messages from our staff who are sitting on the webinar brainstorming essentially about how this work, aligns and connects with the long-range transportation planning process that we've done. As you know, that's been a topic that we've talked about, how we can really use this information that's available through the market value analysis in our own equity analysis work. So it's exciting to see kind of those examples and brainstorms showing up in our chat session. So thank you again so much. We hope everyone enjoyed the webinar today, and definitely look forward to seeing everyone again. I am here to announce that we are going on hiatus for the summer. So we will next host our Better Together webinar back again in September. So look forward to announcements about that, whether it's in your email inbox, your calendar, or on social media, or the PlanRVA full commission calendar. But in the meantime, stay connected with our social media. You can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And keep an eye out for our new blog that will be launching on our website later this summer. We'll have articles released over the next several months with regard to the MVA that can connect you directly to the ArcGIS online website, but also fun information about other things that are happening across our program areas. So as Rashonda often does, I love this so much, she closes with that African proverb that goes like this: if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go farther, go together. At PlanRVA, we are better together. And I hope that today's webinar gave you an example of why this kind of work is just so important to work with our partners. And thank you again, Ira and Michael.
Thank you, Martha.
See you all in September.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.